while I'm giving my talk. I don't mind being interrupted. My plan for tonight is to actually kind of present my lecture as if it was one of my classes back at the university. So I like my students to interject with questions, so feel free to do so as well. But before I begin tonight, actually, I wanted to throw a question out to you all, and perhaps if you just want to just throw back some answers, pardon me, please feel free. Well, what I'll do is jot a few words down on the overhead. And the question I wanted to ask you is, when you hear the word Celtic, what do you think? I want to get the kind of the popular conception of the word Celtic, and I'll write perhaps maybe 5 or 6 words down here, and then we'll see throughout the progress of the talk. That's better. I'll see throughout the progress of the talk if any of these terms that you've all thought of comes up. So, can you just think of a word when you hear the word Celtic and you want to give me the word? Anybody? Just feel free to shout it out. Scotland, thank you. Don't worry, I'm not looking for any right or wrong answers, and I won't be testing you at the end of it. Fighting. Oh, that's a good one. British Isles. Caesar, thank you. Caesar? Any others? Music. Music is a good one. That one might not come up tonight, but we'll see. The chieftains, that could be music or otherwise. So we mentioned Scotland. What? Anything else? Druids. Ireland. Considering the hall that we're in here tonight, I hope that one would come up. And Cornwall, that's a good one. Wales. Gaul, I heard. Dancing. Okay. Basket weaving? Oh, basketball. Oh, hey, that's a good, that one might come up. Maybe one more, and then that's.
How about design? You know, you see pins and things like that are
symbols and things like that. Yeah. Pardon? Cross. Okay, great. Put that up here for now, and maybe I'll put that up. Maybe I'll put that up there again at the end. And we'll see how many of these we can cross off and see what the terms that come up. Pardon? Yep, basketball. Maybe we could have put soccer down there as well, for those of you who are familiar with the football in the British Isles. There's a team called the Celtic Football League. So, the reason I asked the question is because I'm hoping that we'll come to answer that throughout the night. Who are the modern Celts? Who are the ancient Celts? One of the very first questions, of course, people ask is, well, what is this word Celtic? Actually, how do you pronounce this word? Is that coming out all right? Okay. Now, I give 2 answers to that. There's Celtic. Is it Celtic or Celtic? Well, in English, it can be either. You can pronounce the word Celtic or you can pronounce the word Celtic. It's perfectly acceptable for either one. The practice nowadays is to pronounce the word Celtic, so you'll hear me say Celtic. It's closer to what the word would have been pronounced in the actual Celtic languages. Cailteach, for instance, in Gaelic. So if you have the hard K sound at the beginning. Generally nowadays the S sound is reserved for sports teams. So there we have basketball coming up already. The Celtics is also the Celtic Football League in Scotland. The Celtic Football League in Scotland, pardon me. At any rate, Celtic in this part of the world, we think of Scotland or Ireland, so both of those came up. And I'm glad to hear that a lot of you have mentioned, Wales and Cornwall, having driven through Cornwall on the way here tonight, of course. Pardon me. Well, you're right. There all those countries are part of the Celtic world, the modern Celtic world. We have Scotland and Ireland, the Isle of Man, of course, which is right in the middle of the Irish Sea between Ireland and Great Britain, and we have Cornwall, as you mentioned, and we have Wales, and we have Brittany on the continent, in the in the northwest corner of, the northeast corner of France. Each one of those countries has a Celtic language. We're referring to those a little bit later on. But what about the origin of the word Celtic? Well, the origin of the word Celtic, in terms of our usage today, in referring to people coming from one of these 6 countries or speaking one of these 6 languages, it really didn't come to be used in that sense until about perhaps the 16th or 17th centuries, when scholars first began to draw connections between the languages and see that the languages were related. And so they went back in history and took a term from Caesar, for instance, who used the word Celtic in Latin, of course, to refer to a group of people in central Gaul. And he tells us that that those people living in that area use this word for themselves. So we know that the Celts probably called themselves a name, or certainly one group of Celts used the word Celtic to refer to themselves. Another word that comes up is Gaul, referring to the area of ancient France and the people that lived in that area were the Gauls. That is a name that in Latin would have been Galli. The Greeks had a similar term which they used, which was Galatai, which gives us Galatians, but really referring to the Gauls. And that is more likely a word that was used given to them by the Romans and the Greeks, not necessarily a word that the actual Celts themselves probably had for themselves. At any rate, the Greeks and the Latins recognized that these people living in continental Europe had a linguistic and cultural affiliation, though not necessarily a political one. They recognized that they didn't have a centrally organized empire, though their culture, as we will see in a minute, stretched across from what is now Spain and Portugal all the way into what is now Turkey. There was no Celtic Empire in the sense that we think of perhaps as the Roman Empire. They're really more of a conglomeration of tribes or small petty kingdoms led by chieftains. And there we have another term coming up. The ancient Celts are sometimes attributed with some inventions in terms of chainmail, even soap. So those are some interesting tidbits of information. I will show you maybe a slide of a modern artist's representation of what the Celts would look like dressed up in their chainmail. I will also show you another slide of the natural armor described by the the classical authors in their descriptions. A little bit on that right now in terms of the evidence that we have to look at, and I'll be referring to these types of evidence throughout the talk. There are 3 main types of evidence that we rely on in regards to the Celts on the continent. That is linguistic, documentary, and archaeological evidence, and this is all on your outline there that I gave you. The continental Celts, in terms of linguistic evidence, left few written records, though we do have some inscriptions in stone and bronze, which have survived up until today. We also have record of their language from names of tribes and proper names of people recorded by the Greeks and Romans. as well as surviving place names. For instance, Paris is actually named after the Parisii, which is a Celtic tribe living in Gaul. Lyon, France, was originally called Lugdunum or Lugdunum, which is named after the Celtic god Lugh, which was the fortress of Lugh, if you will, and through regular linguistic change ended up being Lyon in France. Just as an example of one of these inscriptions, I thought I would read you a sample of a Gaulish inscription from about 90 AD. This is an inscription that was discovered, deposited at a woman's grave site, and has to do with activities of a coven of sorceresses or female priestesses, if you will. And it follows, herein, a magical incantation of women, their special infernal names, the magical incantation of Ceres, who fashions this prophecy. The goddess Adaxagona maintains Severa, daughter of Certiu, in two cult offices as their scribe and offering maker. Below, where they shall be impressed, the prophetic curse of these names of theirs is a magical incantation of a group of practitioners of underworld magic. Venona, daughter of Flatusia, Paula, wife of Potitos, Aya, daughter of Adiega, it goes on listing a number of names. Kind of cryptic, yes, but some interesting tidbits in terms of, if you want, linguistic evidence to look at people's names, and perhaps if you're into looking into early Celtic religion, it's some information for you there as well. That is usually referred to as the Larzac tablet. In terms of continuing on with the linguistics evidence, looking at the relationships between the Celtic languages is another aspect of Celtic studies, and in a way we look at the Celtic cultures. We see, in looking at the Celtic languages and comparing them, certain features that they have in common, and which are particular to the Celtic languages. A couple of features, just by way of example, are initial consonant mutation and prepositional pronouns. Now, I'm not expecting people to necessarily know what I'm talking about here, but to try to describe that, prepositional pronoun sounds just like what it is. You put a preposition and you put a pronoun together to form one word, where in English we have two words. To give you an example that is found in Scottish Gaelic as well as in Irish, you could think of the two words at and me, preposition and a pronoun. In Gaelic and in Irish, those two words are collapsed into one. So where you would think it would be ek for at in Irish and Gaelic, and me or me in Irish and Gaelic, it collapses and it becomes agam or akam in the two languages. So agam, one word. So that's an example of prepositional pronoun. Initial consonant mutation, which is a feature that every one of the Celtic languages has, is the first letter of a word changes depending on what the word, well, in terms of historical linguistics, the word that came before a word affects the following word. That's kind of a roundabout way of saying it, but and that through regular progression became a grammatical rule. And depending on what Celtic language it is, there are a number of different types of mutation. For instance, in Scottish Gaelic, strictly grammatically speaking, there's just one type of mutation. In Irish, there are two types of mutation. In Welsh, there are three types of mutations. And in Cornish, there are five types of mutations. Perhaps that's why it died. But sorry, bad joke. We will find out Cornish died in the late 17th century. Now, moving on to documentary evidence, histories and the ethnologies are the main sources here, and these are histories and ethnologies written by the Greeks and Romans, the classical authors. They are really the main source for people in Celtic studies, looking at at the ancient Celts and really wanting to arrive at a nice picture of the ancient Celts. They really help flesh out the archaeological record, which can only give us a record of the material culture, of course, and extrapolating from the materials that we can find in archaeological sites. What an example of this is Julius Caesar, I mentioned already, who wrote the Gallic War, and his account of when he led the Romans against the Gauls, which was about the 1st century BC. I will read you a little sample of a classical account of the Celts. This has to do with their type of dress and the way that they fought, for instance. This particular author is Diodorus Siculus. Diodorus the Sicilian, if you will, writing right around the 2nd century BC. He tells us that when they fought their enemies, that they liked to cut off their heads. In his quote, it's, when their enemies fall, they cut off their heads and fasten them about the necks of their horses. And turning over to their attendants the arms of their opponents, all covered with blood, they carry them off as booty, singing a paean over them and striking up a song of victory. And these first fruits of battle they fasten by nails upon their houses, just as men do in certain kinds of hunting with the heads of wild beasts they have mastered. Going on, describing their clothing, he says, the clothing they wear is striking, shirts which have been dyed and embroidered in various colors, and breeches, which they call in their language braccae, and they wear striped coats, fastened by a buckle on the shoulder, heavy for winter wear and light for summer, in which are set checks close together of various hues. That probably sounds familiar. Scotland and Tartan, for instance. For armor they use long shields as high as a man, which are wrought in a peculiar manner to them, some of them even having the figures of animals embossed on them in bronze. And their trumpets are of a peculiar nature, and such as barbarians use, for when they are blown upon, they give forth a harsh sound appropriate to the tumult of war. Some of them have iron cuirasses, chain wrought, a chainmail coat, if you will, but others are satisfied with the armor which nature has given them and go into battle naked. In place of the short sword, they carry long broadswords which are hung on chains of iron or bronze and are worn along the right flank. So we have an interesting depiction of the Celts from a classical author. I have a slide to show you. This is a modern artist's representation of, based on the classical accounts as well as on archaeological evidence. We see the kind of plaid, colorful check-like material that they wore, not necessarily having any kind of affiliations with families or clans, as well as the oblongated shield, which is found in the archaeological record. The sword worn on the right flank, as well as the chainmail coat that he has on. You take a look at his hair, for instance, and that probably looks a little strange. The classical authors, I didn't read you that passage, but they also described that some of the Celts liked to wash their hair in lime water, which not only when dried, made the hair stiff and they were able to make the hair stand on the end in that way. It also made the hair a nice white color, which they seem to have liked. Moving on to archaeological evidence. Archaeological evidence helps identify patterns of geographical distribution of material culture, so we're able to see through the archaeological record how far the Celts spread. So not only do we have the classical writers writing about it, but we can substantiate that in the archaeological record. it's really great when you can bring all three sources of evidence to substantiate one another. It also helps bring to light the period of the Celts that we have no record for, that is before about 400 BC, which is about the earliest that we have the classical authors talking about the Celts. So we have the earlier archaeological record that we have nothing about in writing. Now, in terms of the earliest Celts, which is the next point on the outline, I'll put an example up. That's a particular archaeological piece called the Battersea Shield, found in the Thames in Britain. The particular type of art form that is on there, the particular very distinct, swirling, florid, curvilinear is the key term when describing this art. It's usually referred to as Latin art, and that is from a particular period of the Celts living in Europe, named after a site in Switzerland. The earliest people that we can identify as being Celts, or kind of proto-Celts or precursors to the Celts, existed between 1200 and 400 BC, that is during the European Iron Age. This period is usually divided into two periods. The first, from about 1200 to 450 BC, is referred to as the Hallstatt period, which can be further subdivided, and that is named after an archaeological site in Upper Austria. The second period, from about 450 to 370 BC, is the Latin period, which is very, very characteristically Celtic, and they're definitely speaking a Celtic language by this point. And it's named after, and mentioned after a site on a lake, near a lake in Switzerland, Neuchâtel. And in this lake, they found a large number of votive offerings. We think they're votive offerings now. What that means, objects worked in metal, deposited into bodies of water as offerings to gods. So that's a very typical Celtic trait. So we find wherever the Celts existed, we find in bodies of water a number of metal items that have survived, and wooden items as well. Now, so this period we call Latin. This particular type of art form spread throughout Europe, wherever the Celts had gone, all the way to Ireland, and lasted up into the Middle Ages, really, and further. It's still used today, but it's not the tradition broke sometime after the Vikings started to invade around 1000 AD. So that is an example of this Latin art form. As I mentioned, it's from Britain. It's called the Battersea Shield. I thought it would be interesting, too, to describe some society, the makeup of society of the Celts. The early Celtic society, still referring to the continent here, is often characterized as an heroic society, because it was a society based on the warrior ethic of honor in fighting and warfare and death. The Celts were mostly illiterate. We don't have much evidence of theirs in writing, of any of their languages in writing, other than a few inscriptions that I mentioned. They did, however, have a very highly evolved and very sophisticated oral culture. They're noted for, the classical authors note them for their elaborate verbal style and quick wit, their strong poetry tradition, song tradition, and the hierarchy of poets that they had. It was tribal in nature. The Gaul, for instance, was made up of small territorial-based sub-tribes known as pagi to the Romans, or pagi, similar to clans. There were kin groups who were grouped together into large tribal units. These were mentioned by Caesar. Unification was a very difficult process. The Celts were always at war with one another. There are a few periods throughout history, however, that they were able to come together and unite against a common foe, and one of these is the great warrior king Vercingetorix, who united the tribes of Gaul against Julius Caesar, and he tried to take over Gaul. Vercingetorix succeeded to a certain extent, but the Romans did win in the long run. In terms of population, people in population, it's estimated that in the late Iron Age, the population in Britain was between 2 and 3 million, and in Gaul between 6 and 8 million. In appearance, well, compared to the Romans and the Greeks, the Romans and Greeks like to describe that they had kind of light skin and light hair, but we actually have other accounts that describe other Celts being dark-skinned and dark hair. So it depends on who is describing it, I guess. It's all a matter of perspective. When looking at archaeological sites in Britain, the archaeologists have done an average of height when looking at the remains of males and females, and it seems that males on average were about 5'7", and females about 5'2", so not actually too far off from today, perhaps a little bit shorter. The wealth of archaeological data and classical descriptions really help paint a picture of their appearance and dress. Men in Gaul were described as being shaggy in appearance. One of the names in Latin for the unconquered part of Gaul was Gallia Comata, which means hairy Gaul, referring really to the length of the hair, the shagginess of their hair. They had a fashion for wearing the hair long, sometimes tied in the back, sometimes they kept it short and spiked it with the lime water. They had beards, some of them had beards, but it seems that amongst the noble classes, the higher classes, they liked to shave their cheeks, but keep long mustaches. So we have descriptions of the Celts eating their food and drinking their mead and honey beer and whatnot, and wine, through the mustache, and the mustache acting as a kind of strainer. The spiking of the hair with the lime water is probably not universal. For instance, we have lots of helmets in the archaeological record, and it would be very difficult to have spiked hair and wear a helmet at the same time. Other regional fashions included the shaving, the short hair. It's said that the Gauls shaved their body hair. A number of razors and tweezers are found on certain sites. The Britons were said to have painted their bodies in blue. Perhaps it would have been tattoos. If you look at this wrong one. If we go back to this slide, take a look at the skin on the man. See the swirls in blue. This is a couple based in Britain. So nobody knows really what the patterns would have been on their skin. Just that the artist who painted this chose to put in latin style swirls and florid designs that we find in the metalwork. In terms of dress, I already mentioned that they were colorful and embroidered materials to impress or alarm their foes. In the later Iron Age, the Gauls wore long-sleeved shirts and tunics and long pants called braccae, as I mentioned. This was regarded as effeminate by the Romans. If you picture Romans in film, in historical films, you remember they wore the short kind of tunic type wear. They wore cloaks, especially in the winter, with patterns of checks, tartan, tweed-like designs. They also had a type of brooch to fasten them on the shoulder, These were called fibulae, a type of safety pin-like device. In the later archaeological record in Ireland, for instance, we have kind of round, very elaborate penannular style brooches. They wore belts, especially by the nobility, which helped them hold their swords. The most common Celtic item that we find, or most ubiquitous Celtic find, or we find amongst almost every Celtic group, pardon me, and it was so popular it actually spread to the Romans, was the torque. And this twist is based on the Latin word for twisting, torquis, and they would wear this around. It was also made of twisted metal, and they would wear that around their neck. Unfortunately, he doesn't have one on in that picture, but I have another slide to show you of Celt who has a torque on. Made of different materials, precious metals or non-precious metals. It could have been just a decoration, but more likely it was a symbol of some sort of rank, perhaps only a noble or a status. It could have been some sort of a religious association, some sort of dedication to a god, as simple as a good luck charm, perhaps. The meaning probably varied among the Celts and throughout time, as many fashions did. In terms of the women, classical writers like to mention their beauty, their height, their fertility and courage. We don't have as much information on women from the classical sources as we do the men, which is not surprising because they were more concerned with the political situation in their opponents and in their tribes, as it was the societies in the Celtic world were run by the men. That's why we have more the accounts dwelling on the men. Archaeology sheds more light, though we have to be cautious in making assumptions concerning gender roles. For instance, we can't say that men were responsible for agriculture and that women were responsible for work at the home or making clothes, for instance. The evidence in the archaeological record suggests that men worked in metal crafts, but food production and other crafts such as pottery, basketry, and leatherwork may have been the responsibility of women. So it looks like perhaps the women did the farming. Marriage was more of a partnership among the Celts than it was amongst the Romans. Women in the Roman world went from being under the power of the father to being under the power of the husband. Women in the Celtic world, relatively speaking, had a little bit more equality. That's relatively speaking. Caesar tells us that among the Gauls, the husband and wife kept their money separate and shared any fortunes that were gained, and at death, the surviving partner inherited everything. But despite this, Caesar also says that men had the power of life and death over their wives and their children. The Romans were also scandalized by the alleged promiscuity of Celtic noble women. Diodorus Siculus says, I already quoted from him earlier, he says, "They generally yield up their virginity to others, and this they regard not as a disgrace, but rather think themselves slighted when someone refuses to accept their freely offered favors." And we have the famous words attributed to a Pictish or a Caledonian woman living in Scotland in response to a Roman woman's disdain. Her words are, "We fulfill the demands of nature in a much better way than do you Romans, for we consort openly with the best men, whereas you let yourselves be debauched in secret by the vilest." In terms of female dress, we do have archaeological evidence, a form of dress called the peplos, which was worn not only by Celtic women, but by a number of peoples stretching from the Baltic to the Mediterranean, including Greek women. The peplos was a kind of dress where two rectangles of fabric were put together. For instance, a rectangle of fabric at the front, rectangle of fabric at the back, pinned at the shoulders with the fibulae, these safety pin-like brooches. And they would put a belt around the middle. It would be a very simple and practical garment, very convenient for breastfeeding mothers, for instance. Usually kept to a height just above the ankles. Remember, it probably would have been very muddied, so it would have been convenient to have it high up on the ankle. Other garments included checked tartan-like wraparound skirts or shawls. They also wore cloaks like the men. Fabrics would have been made out of wool, linen, and occasionally we have evidence of imported silk. So we have trading links of silk being produced in China, of course. Not much evidence at all for footwear. Okay, page 3, wherever it went. There we go. Now, in the 3rd century, the Celts underwent a period of expansion and migration. This was the real height of Celtic culture on the continent. They reached their greatest territorial extent and the zenith of their influence and power in this period. The territory encompassed by Celtic-speaking peoples stretched from Spain and Ireland in the west to Turkey in the east. And as I already mentioned, this was not an empire in the sense that we think of it. So looking at this map, I'll try to show louder. So here you can see La Tène on the map here in Switzerland, being, if you will, the heartland of the Celts. We also see Hallstatt in Austria being the earlier Celts. The Celts really spreading out from there, going north, east, west, in all directions. So one of the first areas that they went to was northern Italy, where they encountered the Etruscans. They spread down into northern Italy in the 4th century, perhaps due to internal social pressures. Hearing reports of the wealth of the Etruscans, they would have been familiar with the wealth of the Etruscans because they would have traded with them to a certain degree. The Etruscans were the first to feel the impact of the invading Celts, or we can think of them as Gauls. The still fairly young Roman Republic went to the aid of the Etruscans around 390 or 387 BC. They really weren't much help, and if anything drew the attention of the Celts or the Gauls on themselves. The Celts beat the Etruscans and eventually continued south to Rome itself, sacking the city in 390 BC. Now, how they got rid of the Celts were that they offered them money to leave. So the Romans bribed the Celts. They took the booty and departed, but not without first leaving the city in ruins. Now, northern Italy became largely a Celtic-speaking area. The language we refer to, the Celtic language in this area on the continent is usually referred to as the Pontic nowadays, and it does remain, it does survive in a few inscriptions as well, not very much. It became known by the Romans eventually as Gallia Cisalpina, which means Gaul on this side of the Alps. Now, the Romans conquered this area by 225 BC. The Romans were getting back at the Gauls, perhaps. They eventually went on to conquer southern Gaul, or France, by 124 BC, which they called Gallia Transalpina, naturally Gaul across the Alps. So from the Roman perspective, we have Gallia Cisalpina, Gaul this side of the Alps, and Gallia Transalpina, Gaul across the Alps, which was the southern part of France, remember. This was the first province of the Roman Empire, and was often just nicknamed the province by the Romans. That term, nickname for the province, persisted and actually came to be the name for that region of France today, Provence. Julius Caesar went on to conquer the rest of Gaul by 52 BC, eventually meeting fierce resistance from United Gaul led by Vercingetorix, as I mentioned. Gaulish as a language probably survived until about the 4th or 5th century AD. The Gauls became Romanized, speaking Latin, and with a little bit of a substrate of Gaulish in there. This eventually became heavily influenced when the Germanic Franks invaded Gaul. The Franks eventually gave their name to the country, France, and then the language of the Germanic Franks influenced the Latin that was developing there, which eventually became the French language. In the meantime, the Celts and the Gauls were expanding southeast along the Danube River Valley zone, eventually crossing into Greece and entering Macedonia by 281 BC. So, really following, I'm trying to do this upside down, but this track down here into Greece. But before they got to the southern part of Greece, internal quarrels developed amongst the leaders of the invading Gauls, who we can refer to as Galatians at this point. The Greek term for them, Galatai, we can say Galatians in English. Internal quarrels amongst their leaders led to a split in their armies. One group decided they wanted to go south to the famous oracle of Delphi, hearing of its famous riches, which they did raid in 279 BC, and we have a couple of different accounts. One account says that they succeeded in raiding the oracle. Another account says that they didn't succeed. And then we have accounts later on of a particular Roman general finding remains of some of these raids in a body of water back in Gaul, amongst the Tectosages, a particular Gaulish tribe. So, going on that account, it does seem as if the Celts had been successful in their raid. The other group went on to Turkey and established their own state there, a Galatian state and colony. They're known to us through the Galatians of the Bible, of course. They're almost constantly at war with their neighboring Hellenic city-states, the Greek-influenced city-states, especially the city-state of Pergamon. The Pergamines defeated the Galatians in a great battle around 233 BC. They celebrated their victory over the Galatians by erecting a great monument depicting the dying warriors of the Galatians. By about 150 BC, the Romans controlled that region of Turkey and made a marble copy of part of the monument. Though the original monument no longer exists today, we have some of these marble copies. The Romans called one aspect of this original monument. They called it the Dying Gaul. I'll put a slide up on there in a minute. And we can tell because the Romans went there, copied this statue that they had, knowing that these were Galatians. In calling it the Dying Gaul, the Romans recognized that these people were related to the Gauls back in nowadays France. Now, this is often this is used amongst every Celtic book you pick up. You'll see this picture. It's the picture of the dying Celt par excellence. You will read in the captions. But if you look at him, we see the typical spiked hair that we have read about in the classical accounts. You'll see the very typical torque around the neck. You'll see he's reclined in a kind of dying position. He'd just been fallen, but what you can't see is that he's actually reclined on his shield. We have accounts of the Celts with him reclining on their shield to die. He's got pierced in the side, bleeding. He's got the drooping mustache. And also what you can't see is he's got his sword next to him on his shield. He's also got, you can just see the outline of the silhouette of a trumpet. Right there. And of course the most obvious thing is that he's naked. We have the accounts of the Celts going into battle naked. Now I've read that this could have actually been a good thing in terms of the hygienic or unhygienic situation of the clothing perhaps at the time. To get wounded without any clothes on might have actually would have been more beneficial to being wounded with clothes on and being infected almost immediately from the dirty clothes, which is an interesting perspective, I suppose. Other people have postulated that it was perhaps a kind of to put fear into the opposing army, or even as a type of worship to the gods. The Galatians eventually became Romanized, and when the Apostle Paul wrote his famous letter to the Galatians in the 1st century A.D., he regarded them no differently, really, than any other community in the Roman Empire. Their language did persist, however, until at least the 4th century A.D., when we have an account by St. Jerome, who observed that the language used by the Galatians was similar to that of the Gauls of France. There seems to be a little migration to Ireland after about 600 BC, and so it seems that there are particular language groups, this very, very early form of Irish, which we refer to as Goidelic, which is the older branch of the modern Celtic languages. It seems to have been left to develop on its own. After 600 BC, newer influxes of Celts seem to have come into Britain, bringing another form of Celtic language that was just more recently evolved, and that led to the British forms of Celtic languages like Welsh. And that's why we have the two main branches, the Goidelic branch and the Brythonic or Brittonic branch of Celtic languages. The Goidelic language that I'm referring to eventually developed into Old Irish, which we have a lot of record of in medieval manuscripts, which was in turn reintroduced to the north of Britain, or Scotland, by Irish colonists around 500 AD, as well as the Isle of Man, leading to the development of the modern Gaelic languages, Irish, Scottish, and Manx Gaelic. Old Irish, as I mentioned, we have record of that in the manuscripts. In Britain, the new influx of Celts coming in after 600 BC led to a new form of Celtic language, the Brythonic group. This eventually developed into Welsh and Cornish on the British, on Great Britain itself. It was reintroduced to the mainland of Europe, the continent, in northwest France, in Brittany, which we call today Brittany, between the 5th and 7th centuries. It was called Armoric at the time, actually. So it was reintroduced from the British Isles by these British Celtic settlers during the Germanic invasions. So when the Germans were coming in, the Angles and the Saxons and the Jutes were coming into England. They were putting pressure on the Celts who were already living there. The Celts, some of them picked up, they moved further west into the areas of, pushed them back into Wales and Cornwall, and across the English Channel into northwest France. Now there is just a family tree, if you will, of the Celtic languages. I will those are the two main groups to which I was just referring. The Q Celtic, or is the Goidelic branch. I won't go into the linguistic reasoning behind the nickname there, Q and P, just referring to particular phoneme in the two languages. So Goidelic developing into Irish, Scottish, and Manx, and Brythonic developing into Welsh, Cornish, and Breton. It's a handy chart to refer to whenever you're talking about Celtic languages. Now, in terms of Christianity and writing, Christianity arrived in Ireland around 500 or 5th century in AD, or a little bit earlier than that. St. Patrick is attributed with bringing Christianity to Ireland, of course, but there is some evidence that Christianity already existed in Ireland, at least in the south, with the works of St. Ciaran, perhaps. At any rate, there are many famous Celtic saints. St. Patrick, who wasn't an Irishman, he was from Britain, perhaps from southern Scotland or Wales. Another famous Celtic saint is St. Ninian. Those of you who are familiar with Antigonish are perhaps familiar with St. Ninian's Cathedral there, named after the first saint in Scotland. St. Ninian was a British Celt who was in Scotland in 392 AD. And of course we also have St. Columba, who died in 597. He established his famous monastery on the island of Iona in Scotland, but after the Viking invasions, the headquarters of his tradition moved to Dunkeld in Scotland and to Keld in Ireland. This really began a tradition of learning which was passed down in the monasteries in the Gaelic-speaking world, so in Ireland and in Scotland, as well as in Wales and Brittany, to give its due. A highly developed art form was passed down through the monasteries, and this was the illuminated tradition of manuscripts. And of course, we have the famous Book of Kells, which was composed between 760 and 820, perhaps, which is likely begun on the island of Iona, but was later taken to Kells. It's a Latin manuscript of the Gospels. This is a carpet page from the Book of Kells. This is the famous Chi-Rho, a Greek letter, two Greek letters actually, the Chi and the Rho. If you take a look at these swirling patterns, this is another manifestation of the Latin art that I talked about earlier. So here we have this particular art form persisting even into the medieval manuscript tradition. You also see on there the type of art form that we mostly associate with the Celts nowadays is these interweaving knotwork, which is actually not particular to the Celts. It's also found in the Germanic traditions and particularly Scandinavia, especially where zoomorphic figures or figures incorporating animals are involved. Other types of treasures and artwork constructed in the monasteries had to do with sacred objects like chalices, which would have been used in Mass. Famous treasure is the Ardagh chalice, is actually one of my favorite pieces found in Ireland. It was discovered in about 100 years ago, or a little over 100 years ago, by a boy digging potatoes in County Limerick. It was quite a find, actually. At the time, he not only found the silver chalice that we see here, but he also found another bronze chalice and 4 brooches alongside it, or buried with it. It dates to the early 8th century. It's made of silver, bronze, and gold. And it also has glass with enamel work and a rock crystal in the center of the base. Now, why was it buried is the question to ask here. Probably because of the Viking invasions. The Irish constructed these tall, round towers with doorways very, very high up from the ground, which could only be reached by a ladder. This was to avoid the invading Vikings. They would run up with all their treasures into the round tower and pull up the ladder behind them. This worked sometimes. So they came to burying some of their treasures. Now that's one theory as to why it was buried. Another theory is that during the years of British oppression of Catholicism in Ireland, the Irish had to celebrate Mass in the open air, and when a lookout saw an official coming along, they would have to disperse, and sometimes they would have to throw some of these objects in a quick hiding place. In the area that this boy discovered this object, which is a kind of a ditch, it wasn't even covered in very much dirt at all, really. So that could be another theory as to why it was buried. But it's a really interesting piece because it also shows it's a confluence of many traditions here. We have the Latin tradition surviving. We have influences from the Germanic tradition with the interlacing knotwork, and what I find really interesting is that there is this rock crystal in the base. You see how highly decorated the base is? This is really interesting because this is pre-Vatican II, remember. The Mass would have been said the priest would have said Mass with his back to the congregation, not facing the congregation as they do now. So when he took a drink from the chalice, nobody would see this bottom except God himself, perhaps. So perhaps this is an indication of the artist's own wish to show his work off to God, and knowing that nobody else is really going to see it. It's really an interesting piece, and my favorite part's the bottom, actually. I mentioned a few minutes ago that Old Irish survived we have record of Old Irish surviving in a number of manuscripts. Now, this is a very important basis for Irish literature. The oldest writing that we have in Irish dates to about the 6th century, which is a eulogy on St. Columba, or Ardra Columcille, and we know that Columcille died in 597 BC, and this particular poem was written by Donlan Forgill, and we know when he lived, which was roughly after this period. Although the manuscript itself does not survive from this period, the manuscripts were copied and survived that way, and this particular eulogy was written down in the margins of a manuscript. And then, of course, we have whole manuscripts written in Irish, many of them, which preserve a number of narrative prose tales, form the basis of the 4 main cycles of medieval Irish literature, which I won't go into tonight. Now, in terms of the 6 Celtic languages today, what kind of state are they in? I mentioned Cornish. Cornish did die out in the late 17th century, early 18th century. Dolly Pentraeth is often considered to be the last speaker of Cornish. It does exist, though, today. It has been revived They don't have any recordings of the language, of course, but they were able to reconstruct the language from manuscripts. There are families in Cornwall who have brought their children up to speak the language as their first language, alongside English, of course, so that the language has been revived and is actually quite strong in terms of the Cornish language movement. It still has a ways to go in terms of increasing numbers, of course, but now the Isle of Man is the other modern Celtic language that died in more recent times. The last speaker is said to have died in the 1970s, so not too long ago, but it's in a much more enviable position in terms of perspective of the Cornish, in that we do have recordings of speakers of Manx. Also, we have people who have learnt from native speakers of Manx, so one can argue that Manx Gaelic didn't really die, because there are a number of speakers today, and it is taught in the Manx school system. Scottish Gaelic, you'll hear differing figures in terms of numbers. You hear anywhere from 50,000 to 80,000 Scottish Gaelic speakers, native, that is, as their first language, and perhaps a million more learning the language. Now there will be a number of other native Gaelic speakers around the world, but strictly speaking in Scotland between 60 or 50 and 80,000. Now Ireland, there is no official status for the language in Scotland, by the way, though they're working on establishing some sort of secure status for the language, which is the phrasing that they use there. In Ireland, Irish is the official language, and it is taught in the school system. Now, you also hear different figures there in terms of native speakers, perhaps as much as 100,000, but more than 1 million can speak the language because of to a certain degree, because of it being taught in the school system. But it is the official language of France. It's the official language of Ireland in the way that French is the official language of Canada. That leaves us Welsh and Breton. Welsh is an official language in Wales. It's the only other language in the United Kingdom that has any official status besides English. It is probably the strongest of the Celtic languages, in that it has the most numbers of young people being brought up speaking the language. Breton is really, really hard to say what the state of Breton is, because the French won't recognize that the language exists, and they won't include it in their censuses. But the last estimates put it actually at the most numbers of speakers of any of the Celtic languages. They had the most, but that was a while ago, and they think they were probably mostly older people, and that the language has the numbers have since dropped. So it's really hard to tell in that way. Now, of course, all of the Celts spread to the New World, and here we are in a part of the world where many of the Celts came to, the Irish and the Scots. Gaelic being spoken on PEI here. It's estimated the numbers at the turn of the century, around the 1900s, that perhaps even a third of the population spoke Scottish Gaelic. Now, of course, you'd be very hard-pressed to find anybody who can speak Gaelic as their first language here. Perhaps one or two left who can still speak it to some degree, to a little bit. And then, of course, in Nova Scotia, right next door, New Scotland, the real center of the Gaels, or any of the Celts really, in terms of the existence of language, persistence of language in Cape Breton. Now, numbers of speakers of Gaelic in Cape Breton, it's hard to say as well, because it's not on our censuses in Canada. Perhaps in a few thousand, or in the low part of that, maybe over 1,000. Now, other Celtic groups, there are Welsh in Patagonia, in Argentina, and there is a Welsh language movement in Patagonia as well. If you go to language immersion in Wales, you would inevitably find 2 or 3 Patagonians there who can speak if they can't speak English, they would speak Spanish. And so in a way that's good in these immersion courses, because it forces the people who know English and who are there to learn Welsh to speak Welsh to their Patagonian friends, because they have no other language in common. There are Cornish that came over to this part of the world, and you'll find a few people, you can count them on one hand really, who can speak Welsh in Canada and the United States, really. And in terms of Manx, they came over as well, but not really up on any of the numbers there, or the status of Manx in Canada and the United States. But with that, I think I will leave the talk. Thank you for inviting me, George, to speak tonight, and a really safe journey back home. If there are any questions, I would be happy to answer them.
Questions? Where did the art of weaving come from? The clothes.
Where did the art of weaving their clothes come from? I can't answer that. That's a good question. Does anybody know the origins of weaving? It's a necessity, yeah, sure. I don't think it was necessarily a Celtic invention, but any other questions? Yes?
You mentioned the earlier design is weaving.
Yes? Thereabouts, yes.
What about the range?
I don't think New Grange is usually described in terms of lateen. That is more characteristically very, very tight swirls, filling the whole surface of the rock. I don't think that's necessarily that scholars describe that as lateen. Have you read that they've described that as lateen? No. Okay. It's similar to it, yeah. I think that's more from the Neolithic period, unless they came and put the designs on there afterwards. I'm not all that familiar with the New Grange site, other than seeing pictures of it and reading about it in its role in the cycles of literature as a kind of burial grounds and a place where the Irish gods kind of come into the stories. Unfortunately, that's not one thing that we have are able to tell much record of. The children aren't mentioned very much in the classical accounts. They certainly, in terms of the house construction, it seems to indicate that they did live in extended families. They lived in these round-type huts. Look in the background of this picture, you see one of these typically Celtic huts. In Britain, they're round, and on the continent, they tend to be square or rectangular. Thatched roof, yes, with wattle and daub walls. Mm-hmm. Yes, that's one of the more famous Celtic sites, and he's called the Hochdorf Prince, and he's from the Hallstatt period actually, and that's a great find, in very elaborate burial procedure, filling it in, covering it in a kind of wood timber framed box, and then covering it all over in stones, and then covering it all over with earth and then turf, so it just looked like a natural hill, perhaps. It's a great find. Yeah, they excavated that, and they found that he was buried with laid out on a bronze couch, which was carved in a lot of very. That's right. Yes, that's right. The hunting tools, yes. Drinking equipment. That's right. A Greek. That was a crater, or a crater, a Greek crater, which was they've tested in the biological lab. They've tested the contents of this cauldron, this big huge kettle, which was imported from Greece, and they found that it was probably a mead, like a kind of honey beer or honey wine. I encourage you to try it if you ever go to Cornwall or wine. It's very strong stuff. Mm-hmm. I don't really. The tribes, the society was tribal, probably divided up into clans, into family units in that way. Not necessarily the way we think of clans in Scotland, but living in probably larger tribal units with living over a wider territorial area, which would have been made up of family groups, clans in that manner. It's not entirely clear. Well, in terms of Scotland, it's like a sub-clan, but in terms of the ancient Celts, I'm not sure about if they would even use that terminology. In Ireland, in Scotland, the modern notion of clans, yes. Sept and clan. Clan seems to be more of the more ruling the family group who has the more power, and sept seems to be more of the sub-clan or a related family, an associated name with the kind of overarching clan.
Was the bagpipe peculiar to those people, the Celtics?
No, we find bagpipes everywhere. The earliest form of bagpipe was found actually in a tomb in Egypt. It's one of the earliest forms of types of instruments that were invented. It is really sticking a reed type instrument into a bladder. It was in the Middle Ages in Europe. It was a very widespread folk instrument, and there are lots of different types of bagpipes found, from Germany to Italy to England to Spain to, of course, Scotland and Ireland. Of course, the Scottish bagpipe becoming the most famous because it was the only bagpipe which kind of progressed out of the folk tradition and into a more it was supported by the clan chieftains, for instance, and so it went beyond the folk tradition, developed into a classical art form in terms of the type of music that was played on it.
If I could just go back to the first part of your talk, you're talking about invading eastward across the continent and going to Greece and so on. What's the mechanics of that? That was over several decades, right? Now, did the warriors go and do their share and then come back, or did the families go with them?
Good question.
And if so, I mean, how did they hold an area unless they could move families?
Yeah.
Or did they leave, were there areas where there were people on guard all the time, and they were relieved by new recruits coming from the west, or I mean the mechanics of the whole thing?
That's it. You've answered your own question there. Yeah, it's all of the above, really. It is actually more than decades, it's centuries spreading across there. The record that I talked about the Gauls or the Galatians spreading into Greece and then Turkey. It seems that the two groups that split up in Greece and one going down to the south to the Oracle of Delphi seem to really just consist of warriors. We have the descriptions of the other group, which is the larger group, actually being a colonial group consisting of women and children and the aged, going over into establishing the colony of Galatia in Anatolia. And then we have records of or indications that there was a continued migration from Gaul, crossing the Hellespont, the bridge over into to Anatolia, continuous over this period. Yeah.
But were they nomadic to a certain degree? Were they? I mean, if you were a child being born, you know, at a certain time, now, through your course of your life, if you were born in that period of history, would you know different homes along the way? Just wondering about how this.
Well, I'm not sure how nomadic they would have been during one person's lifetime. I can tell you that it was encouraged that young men, before they became members of the tribe, would go out and seek their fortune, if you will, and join a kind of young warrior band. And we have indications of this in the Irish literature, as well as in the classical accounts. And the Romans often hired them as mercenaries. The Gaisatai, the famous young warrior tribe, the young warrior groups hired as mercenaries. So, in terms of how much they would move around in one person's lifetime, I'm not sure. Yes. Sorry, I mean Scottish Gaelic speakers. Yeah, that's a terminology thing I should clarify. That when I refer to when I say Gaelic, I mean Scottish Gaelic, and when I refer to Irish, I just say Irish. It's just in terms of the modern terminology. In Ireland itself, they refer to the language as Irish, rather than in English they refer to it as Irish. In the language, it's actually Gaelic or Gaelic. What was the question? The third of the population. 3 Centuries on the Island is a very good book. I believe that's the title. The Clark books is a good book on that. Some of the censuses, yeah, have some language questions on it. Yeah. I mean, in terms of looking at the population of the island today, that the Highland Scots are still the majority of the population in terms of descent, and then it seems to be that the Irish are, and then the English. Yes, he's passed away recently, yeah. Yeah. That's a very strong Gaelic-speaking area, Hartsville, yeah. Codroy Valley of Newfoundland, yeah, it didn't come from Scotland, it came from Cape Breton. Yeah. The Irish influence, of course, is very strong in Newfoundland, and the Irish term, in terms of the Irish language term for Newfoundland, is Talavaniashk, which is the land of fish, interestingly enough. Any other questions? No. Thank you very much.
I'll express thanks on behalf of the audience as well, Michael, for a very, very interesting and comprehensive overview of the Celtic people. Obviously, the number of questions that you got points out the fact that I think there's a great deal of interest in this particular area, and maybe we'll have you back again for future lecture series to expand on a particular area of the great overview that you gave here tonight. So once again, on behalf of the group here, we really appreciate you taking your time and traveling over from St. Francis in somewhat threatening weather in spots today, I understand, to be with us here tonight. So once again, thanks tremendously. Just one item of trivia for, we referred to the Manx people. I understand as of a couple of years ago that there was 2 Manx families on the island, or folks of Manx descent, one of whom most folks here will know. Lorne Pheavens, who you hear on CBC on a regular basis talking about music, he's of Manx descent. So we have that Celtic group represented on the island as well.
We're all represented here.
Yeah.
I just wanted to point, if you're interested in some further text on this topic, a nice, very nice general text on the topic is the text I use in my course on Celtic civilization at St. Francis Xavier. It's called The World of the Celts by Simon James, and it's actually even a great coffee book. It's scholarly, but at the same time, it's really a great book for picking up and reading tidbits of information. It's got a lot of great colored plates, and it really is a great overview. So if you're interested in that, it's a little bit more expensive, but it's really, really worth the text. A number of my students have mentioned that they quite like it. It's very readable, and I also mentioned that when they've taken the book home during Christmas exams, for instance, their parents, they had to steal it away from their parents because they kept on picking it up and looking at it. So I don't have it stocked in the book company or anything like that. It's just recommended that.
And recommend, I understand the library at the University of PEI has a tremendously good collection of Scottish and Irish material and Celtic material. So if your interest is piqued here tonight, check out UPEI. A word about our next lecture in the series. No lecture next Friday, being Good Friday. We always take Good Friday off. The week after that, April the 5th, Dr. Padre Gushiel is going to be here from St. Mary's University, and he's going to be speaking about Erskine Childers and Pierce Beasley, Damned Englishmen and Irish Politics. So, highly recommended, always entertaining and always educational. So do turn out and see Padre Gushiel on April the 5th. Now, we have a bit of a lunch for you there, so help yourself. There's blueberry muffins. My wife tested them out on me, and I highly recommend them. And sandwiches and some banana bread, and there's still some tea and coffee. So no hurry. Stay around as long as you want. Chat it up, and hopefully we'll see you all next week.